Welcome to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. This is Pat Garrett, the Communications Director here at WILL, or WILL, and I want to introduce you to our host, Rick Essenberg, President and General Counsel of the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Rick is a frequent litigator in state and federal courts. He's a go-to expert on constitutional law, limited government, and the separation of powers. Rick founded WILL with a clear mission to advance the rule of law, protect individual liberty, and defend our constitutional principles. Now he's bringing that expertise to our brand new podcast, If You Can Keep It. The plan is for 6 episodes over the summer, and we'll have a full schedule out on our website, will-law.org/podcast. Our second episode will be out on June 30th, just before the 4th of July, and we'll talk about all things Independence Day and American history. Rick, welcome.
Good afternoon, Pat.
Well, Rick, let's talk a little bit about the name we chose for this podcast and just get into why you wanted to get this started.
Well, this is an oft-cited story about the Constitutional Convention. So you imagine the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The delegates were locked away. There was no television, there was no radio, there was no public gallery. You didn't have Fox News up in a booth overlooking the proceedings. And so people waited outside to find out, what had happened. And so when the convention concluded its business, the story comes down to us from a delegate from Maryland who recorded it at the time. Ben Franklin, who was a delegate to the convention, he was approached by a woman named Elizabeth Willing Powell. She was sort of a Philadelphia socialite, but very influential. She ran a sort of a salon where she would entertain luminaries there in Philadelphia back in the late 18th century. And she goes up to Ben Franklin and she says, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" And the story continues that Benjamin Franklin answered by saying, "A republic, if you can keep it." And the reason that this story keeps getting told again and again and again over the course of the next 200 and some years is that we have really a remarkable constitutional document. It is the oldest extant constitution in the world now. It has created a system of government which is really unparalleled, but it's never secure, right? We have to keep working to make sure that we can maintain this system of government. People also invoke the famous speech by Ronald Reagan. Now he delivered this speech. He wasn't yet president. He delivered it January 5th, 1967, when he was being inaugurated as governor of the state of California. And he said that liberty is never more than one generation from extinction. Right? We don't pass it along to our children in the bloodstream. We have to fight to maintain it. And he said it was important that we do so that one day in our sunset years, you can just imagine Reagan saying this, in our sunset years, we will not find ourselves telling our children and our children's children about what it was like way back when in the United States when men were free. And, if you talk about the work we do at WILL, I think a lot of it is about, I think the essential mission is to keep the republic. And that's why we spend a lot of time talking about how decisions are made. Like who gets to decide whether there will be COVID restrictions? Who gets to decide whether there will be tariffs? That these are important guarantors not only of good decision making, but of liberty. And we spend a lot of time talking about, the rule of law and why it's important to follow the rules, even though it seems inconvenient at times. And so all of this is, I think, summed up in, Ben Franklin's warning to us, really, back from 1787. You have a republic if you can keep it, right? You must keep it.
Well, so, when we were planning out the podcast, we were going to come up with a number of topics, and one of them, I think, was the big, beautiful bill. And I think we will touch on that at some point in this episode or the next. But, times are changing and things happen, and the news cycle goes from topic to topic. And one of the things that we just saw is what's happening in Los Angeles, and the initial riots in Los Angeles. And I think we're seeing, more protests, more potential riots planned in other cities across the country. The governor has threatened to sue the president over the use of National Guard. So, why don't you give us a 30,000-foot view of the situation? Let's dive into this topic. And I have a couple other follow-up questions maybe for you, but what's your initial reaction to what happened?
Well, I think this is a quintessential rule of law issue. And it's a rule of law issue that has some criticism for both sides, really. Although, in the case of what's happening in Los Angeles, my understanding is that ICE has conducted some immigration raids. The raids are not necessarily directed at people who are, associated with gangs or drug dealing or things like that. But the fact of the matter is that there are people who are in the country unlawfully, and the fact that they aren't criminals or they aren't drug dealers or they aren't members of gangs or terrorists doesn't mean they can stay. Now, prudence might dictate that the universe of bad guys be the first people who are targeted, but under United States law, there are certain people who are here that are not legally entitled to be here, and the government has the right to remove them. Now, it has to do that in accordance with the law governing deportation proceedings. And there's been a lot of controversy as to whether or not the president has the right to basically skirt due process requirements. I don't think he does. But what we have in Los Angeles is a group of people who don't like the law, right? They wish it were otherwise. They think that individuals who are subject to deportation, at least some of them that haven't committed crimes, they ought to be permitted to stay. Now, that's a position that one can take and advocate for that as the law of the land. But until it is the law of the land, it needs to be followed. And your objection to it should be expressed by, going to Congress, seeking a change in the law, asking the administration to change its deportation priorities, peacefully protesting if you wish. But, setting cars on fire, throwing rocks at law enforcement vehicles, shutting down the 101 expressway. But if you've ever been in Los Angeles, the expressway is a nightmare. Even when it's open, I can't imagine what it's like if someone shuts it down. These are things that fundamentally reject our constitutional settlement and the rule of law, and they ought not to be excused.
And I think it's important. This is an important topic because there are two sides to this in a lot of ways. There's people saying, like I said, we have a right. They would say we, not me, but we have a right to a peaceful protest. And you're saying clear, and the video is clearly that it's not.
Right. So when you have fire and smoke and rocks flying through the air, that is by definition not a peaceful protest, right? All sorts of examples of peaceful protests. The civil rights movement in the United States of America was, generally speaking, a peaceful protest. And it's one of the reasons why it was effective, because it was nothing but people making this moral claim that that people ought not to be discriminated against on the basis of their race. And, at the end of the day, that moral claim was irrefutable. Right? No one could stand up to that. And absolutely true that there were, there were some urban riots later on in the 1960s, but that's not how the civil rights movement succeeded. That's not how we got the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We got it through peaceful protests led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and others.
So the Governor Newsom, has basically put out some sort of statement or issued that he's going to potentially sue President Trump over the use of the National Guard. And I think this covers the Sedition Act, I believe. Where are you at this? Like, how successful could that be?
Yeah, I don't know that it's going to be successful. I mean, the National Guard is generally at the command of a governor of a particular state. So here in Wisconsin, it would be Governor Evers. It's Governor Newsom in California. But the law also provides that the president may assume command of the National Guard under certain circumstances. And the question will be, are one of those circumstances, present here? And I think the case that's good, the fact that's going to make Governor Newsom's case hard is there are some Office of Legal Counsel opinions going back a number of years, actually some by later Chief Justice William Rehnquist, a native of Milwaukee, as it turns out. And he said, look, the president does have the right to nationalize the Guard, to take the Guard under federal control in order to keep the operations of the federal government going. And I think that the Trump administration is going to argue that that's what we're doing here. We've got agencies that it's their job to enforce the immigration laws. This is being interfered with, and we're entitled to use the National Guard because the police don't seem to be able to do the job. My guess is, without spending more time on it, reading the briefs, learning more about it, is that Newsom probably loses this case, but we'll see.
Okay. No, I think that's great perspective, because I think, when we touched on this conversation, these protests are being announced in other cities. I think this is going to be a question that comes up with other governors potentially, especially in just like the blue state versus the President Trump, who's a Republican dynamic. The other topic I think we want to move to is one that's really being debated heavily in Washington right now, and that's the big beautiful bill.
I think it's the one big beautiful bill. Some may say it's not beautiful, but there's a lot of decent. Well, it is one, and it is big. We can at least concede those things.
I think for conservatives, you can make the argument there's a lot of good things in the bill. As conservatives tend to want lower taxes. I think there's been talk of Medicaid reform, but there's also hesitation over spending cuts, and I think we see resistance from conservative Republicans like Senator Johnson. Where would you be on this?
Well, I mean, there are spending cuts, but they're not really significant, and they're not enough to overcome, the problem that led to the need for the OBBB, if we want to call it that. The problem is back in 2017, Congress decided to cut taxes. At the same time that it cut taxes, it simplified and rationalized the tax code. And, from my perspective, that was probably the best thing about the 2017 tax bill, is that it eliminated a lot of things that just made no sense, and it made it very much easier to file your tax return.
Give some examples of that. Like,
what do you mean? Very few people itemize now because what it did is it eliminated a lot of tax preferences. Like, it eliminated the deduction. Well, it didn't eliminate it. It limited the deduction for state and local taxes. And, so a lot of people who used to itemize, they don't itemize anymore, and that makes filing their tax return very simple. It lowered the corporate tax rates, which most economists, I think, will tell you is a good idea, right? You should probably tax money where it stops, not at intermediate steps. And it cut taxes. And it cut taxes, the thing that Democrats would typically argue is that, this is a tax cut for the rich, right? We heard it so many times in 2017 that I began to think it was a new word, and it was one word: tax cut for the rich. And but But the problem with that is that it wasn't just that. It was actually disproportionately a tax cut for the middle class. Certainly if you tallied up all the money that various income groups were going to save in taxes, rich people would save more because they pay a heck of a lot more in taxes. But I always used to use the example of my son, who made a lot less money than me back then, at least, and I got a bigger tax cut than he did, but he got a tax cut that was a much higher percentage of the total taxes that he paid, and I think probably had a more significant impact on his family and their budget than my tax cut had on mine. So, but the problem is that the tax cut was going to blow a hole in the deficit. And, because of the rules that they have and the odd way that they report things, they got around that by making the tax cut expire inside of a 10-year period. So they expire at the end of this year, 2025. Well, the problem is that if they don't do something, everybody's taxes are going to go up.
The tax cuts are set to expire, and they're basically going to then...
Because they're set to expire at the end of this year. And so everybody is going to have a significant tax increase. Yes, rich people will, but middle-class people will too. And it'll have a bigger impact on the middle-class people than it will on the rich people in terms of how they live their daily lives. And so from both from a sort of a health of the economy perspective and from the perspective of who's going to howl and which politicians are going to be in trouble, extending the tax cuts in some way is an imperative. Now, ideally what you would do is that you would have offsetting spending cuts to use the term pay for. I don't really like that term, but we'll use it. To pay for these tax cuts, to offset them, so we don't have an increase in the deficit. That's not happening in the OBBB. The spending cuts are not that significant. Some of them may be good, but they're not that significant. Plus, they've kind of, and maybe this is just a question of, sausage being made, but they've also larded the bill with, some tax provisions that don't really make a lot of sense. Like, no taxes on tips. Why should tips be any different than anything else?
So you're kind of like you're not with everybody. A lot of this other trend here. A lot of people are saying, no, we want to support the no tax on tips provision. You're not necessarily there.
Well, no. I mean, the thing about taxes is that a tax code should be simple. The base should be broad. That is, we shouldn't have a lot of exemptions of things from taxation. The base should be broad and the rate should be low. And, what this is we used to talk about, Gucci Gulch, all the lobbyists wearing really nice shoes because they made so much money, lobbying for exemptions from the tax code. We're going to exempt this, we're going to exempt that. As I said before, when we started, the 2017 tax bill was something that got rid of a lot of that stuff. And that was good, right? We broadened the base, we lowered the rates, moving in the right direction. But here we've taken a step back with the no taxes on tips because Donald Trump wants to carry Nevada, and there's a lot of tip workers that work in Nevada. It doesn't.
And he did, for the record, he did carry Nevada.
And it did carry Nevada, and it's not the most expensive provision because they capped it in certain ways, and a lot of people that are tipped, they don't pay a lot of taxes anyway. But the other thing they did is they increased the limits on the deduction for state and local taxes. It used to be that what is right now that you can only deduct $10,000 in state and local taxes. Basically, I think either a sales tax or a combination of the property and income tax. And there's a lot of people don't pay that much.
Because I think the SALT deduction now is going to go up to $40,000.
Yeah, $40,000. Now, there really aren't a lot of people that pay $40,000 in state and local taxes, so that maybe in this
Well,
case,
they live in California, they live in New York, they live in Los Angeles, probably.
yeah, those are the places. Well, in Wisconsin, it's not hard to pay $40,000 in state and local taxes, but you got to be fairly well-to-do in order for that to happen.
And in a lot of ways, that's a huge tax cut for wealthy Americans.
In that sense, it is. And the other problem with it is that it really violates this principle of broad base and low rates, because what it is a subsidy to people who live in states that have high taxes, right? The federal government is saying, wow, you're paying all this. New York has decided to spend all this money and tax you for it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give you a break on your obligation to support the federal government. You won't have to pay as much as you otherwise would. And the justice in that is, let's say, unclear.
I mean, just what we see in a lot of the population migration data is people are leaving Illinois, leaving New York, leaving California. I mean, that was since the first Trump tax cuts from 2017, maybe when the SALT deduction was down to 10,000. We're now seeing it go up to 40,000. Maybe that reverses some of the trend. Maybe some of that migration.
Yeah, maybe. Although my guess is that Florida is still going to be swamped with people. I think that it's better to pay no taxes at all than be able to deduct them from the federal.
That's a fair point, and that's probably what Ron DeSantis himself would say. So, one other aspect of the big beautiful bill, though, I think is the one big beautiful bill, is spending, and I think. I don't want to necessarily talk just about the bill, but let's talk about this concept of cutting spending in Washington. And it seems like that no matter what, spending continues to go up. Both parties have said, or Republicans specifically have said they want to cut spending. They don't seem to do that. What do you make of that? Why can't Republicans cut spending?
This has been a long-standing problem. We have a $36 trillion national debt. That is more than our GDP in a single year. And it's been trending this direction for a long time, and it's largely driven by Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These entitlements, these are called entitlements because the way they work is that if you qualify for them, you get the money. And the government is obligated to pay it. You're entitled to have the government pay it. I mean, it's not entitlement in this sense is not a moral judgment on somebody. It's just this is the way it works. And we've heard a lot about DOGE and cutting waste in government spending, and I'm all for cutting waste in government spending, but you cannot solve our deficit problem without addressing entitlements. You simply can't, because they and when you add in the discretionary spending in the federal budget is about 14% right now.
Is discretionary spending kind of what covers U.S. aid?
Yeah, that would be it's good for you to ask for clarification there. That would be running the national parks. That would be running the basic federal departments, running the Department of Justice, all of that stuff. It's only 14% of the federal budget. Another 13% is defense. Like, nobody really wants to cut defense in a dangerous world. And so you got 73%, which is all this other stuff, entitlements, interest on the debt, which has gone up because interest rates have gone up. And so unless you're willing to touch that stuff, you're not serious about addressing the deficit. You just can't. And the problem, I think, and the reason why Republicans can't do it and Democrats can't do it, is that there's no way to do it that doesn't involve pain. You're going to have to settle finally, I think, on some combination of raising taxes, reducing benefits, extending the retirement age, limiting, the annual increase in benefits for inflation. All of that stuff is going to be on the table, and people aren't going to like it.
I think even just doing one of those would cause a problem. Let alone you'd probably have to do all four or five.
Right, and you see what's happened with the way the politicians have reacted, because politicians, if they're really good at anything, they're really good at knowing what people won't like, and they avoid what people won't like, because then those people will vote against them. And so you see what's happened. We have this deficit problem going into 2017, going in before the tax cut bill. We had a big problem then, and both candidates for president said that they weren't going to touch Social Security and Medicare. That's the third rail of politics. I mean, the only prominent political leader who has really tried to do something about it was Paul Ryan, and look what happened to him. And so, and then
it does seem like there's a nice theme here, though. We talked about Ron Johnson kind of trying to hold the line on spending. Paul Ryan, another one. Seems like Wisconsin kicks out some decent fiscal conservatives. Maybe?
Wisconsin does, and I give Ron Johnson a lot of credit for standing up on this. It's not popular. I know he may not be running for re-election, but it doesn't matter. I think he's entitled to some credit for being. You have to have a critical mass of Republicans who will stand up and say, no, we want to go in a different direction. We need larger spending cuts here, and he's done that.
So I want to kind of wrap up this last segment where we just, the big beautiful bill. You're a congressman, you're a senator. Would you vote for it or no?
What I'd want to see happen is I'd want to have additional spending cuts, and it becomes really a prudential question because it passed by one vote in the House, and you're probably going to have to pass something that's less than ideal to get there. But I think my position now would be I got to have more spending cuts in this bill in order to pass it, because the way it is now, it increases the deficit by $4 trillion over the next 10 years. Well, the deficit has almost doubled since the beginning of 2017. The last thing that we should be doing is raise it even more, particularly when we know we have this big problem with entitlements, which is only going to get worse. And the reason it's going to get worse, Pat, as you know, is all the baby boomers like me who are going to be hanging it up.
We wanted to wrap up each episode with, we thought a fun way to close out the program is an off-the-cuff segment. So we don't share this question with you in advance. We solicited questions from some of your colleagues. We have...
These are not going to be good.
Well, we come up with some ideas too, and so we'll see. We're just going to throw something out there, and we'll see if what you come up with. So this first question, we debated with a couple different people, but we're going to make it a little easier for your first episode. If you had to define yourself in a movie, either it's your favorite movie, walk us through why, and if there's a movie character that you gravitate to. Maybe it's Harry Potter, but who would that be?
Well, the funny thing is that I typically say that all life's questions are answered in The Big Lebowski. But at the same time, I have to admit, I am very undude-like. So I can't really identify with the guy. I used to tell a story. Now I'm going to invoke a television character, which
is close. Go ahead.
It's close. But this is a television character from an obscure show in the late 1960s. It was called Judd for the Defense, and it was this. For some reason, I never watched Perry Mason back then. I've watched it since. I kind of like it for its style, but Judd for the Defense was about this heroic defense lawyer who, just like Perry, his clients were always innocent, and he fought for them against all odds. And that was the thing. That was the television show that made me decide that I wanted to be a lawyer. Judd for the Defense, which I don't think anybody watched except me.
Wow. I mean, I never heard of the show, but it does make sense.
And you are not, and it has nothing to do with age. I mean, if you talk to most, people my age, they've never heard of the show either.
Thank you to everyone for turning into our first episode. We hope to have you back next week. As I said at the beginning, the plan is for 6 episodes over the summer, and we'll have a full schedule out on our website at will-law.org/podcast. We'll see you all on June 30th for our Independence Day American History themed episode.